It's time for Real Estate 101 with the Karey Brown team from Realty Executives Preferred Advisors.
Good Sunday morning to you. This is Karey Brown, broker, owner of Realty Executives Preferred Advisors here in Topeka, and you're listening to Real Estate 101. Today I am here with Vern Jarboe. Vern is an attorney here in town. He's a real estate attorney. He is our go-to man in real estate. Good morning, Vern.
Good morning, Karey. How are things?
They are good. The thought today was to talk about different expectations of real estate agents. So, being a real estate agent, this should be fun. Everybody has expectations of what their realtor can do, and there are certain things that we can't do. We're not supposed to do, and so really today is to hear it from the man who knows the different things that we do and what we don't do. I think it was Vern that said that our job is to be the matchmaker and to find you the house, and from there to advocate as best we can with what we know. So let's talk about, when it comes to inspections, Vern, let's talk about what the legal stance on that is, what a realtor can do and what they can't do, and how buyers should protect themselves.
Okay, that's a really good topic. Unfortunately, the average buyer typically thinks they're going to buy a perfect home, and those, of course, actually don't exist, in fact. So what we do inspections for is really to try to identify the concerns that a reasonable buyer would have in terms of what condition the property should be in. We know it's not going to be perfect even if it's new, but we ought to be able to look at it and think about what that buyer needs. And for example, if you were selling me a home and you tried to sell me an older home, I would tell you, because I do understand what your role is, that, well, that's not a good idea, Karey, because I'm not really good at maintenance. I have to hire that kind of thing done. So selling me an older home where I have to have a painter over to the house every couple of weeks just to keep up, that doesn't make any sense. So it's up to me as the buyer to help you understand what my needs are and what my expectations are when I get into that home. And secondly, the realtor really needs to understand from their perspective that they are not the inspector. And unfortunately, a lot of buyers seem to think that realtors will be experts at the condition of property issues, and that's really not where the training is. As you said, realtors are trained in the matchmaking responsibilities, helping a buyer-seller deal with getting the property into contract and working the transaction toward closing. But in terms of inspection, realtors are not plumbers or electricians or whole house inspectors or termite inspectors or any other specialty type inspection you want to think about. The realtor's job is to help the buyer hire someone who can do that sort of thing. And unfortunately, a lot of buyers seem to think that the realtor is also going to be an inspector. And it's tempting, I think, probably sometimes for realtors to think of themselves somewhat as inspectors, because after a few years of experience, you've been out on a lot of inspections. Karey, if you think about it, how many whole house inspections have you been to?
Oh, mercy, I don't even know anymore. Hundreds.
It would be in the hundreds.
Oh, yeah.
So you've watched it done, but that doesn't make you the expert, and that's really where the realtor needs to keep their focus.
If anything, it taught me what I don't know.
Yeah, that's a good point, because you see the inspector find something, and sometimes you're amazed.
Yeah.
How did he or she know to do that?
Exactly. And, the things that we see that are hard to explain and express to a comfort level for a buyer, but I've seen inspectors that, I've never seen make a mistake. They're human. It's not uncommon for them to miss something. And then there are things that are what they deem to be important. If it's not structural, if it's not, mechanical, then it's not uncommon for them to miss it, or, they weren't necessarily looking for it. They were looking for what they were hired to do. And that was to find the major mechanical items. And they all kind of reference cosmetic stuff, and if they see it, they'll point it out. But another thing is obstruction. I mean, we've had cases where closets were so full that there would have been no feasibly possible way other than him unpacking these people to see certain things. So, some of it...
Yeah, that's a good point, and especially when you think about basements.
Absolutely.
Because even those people who have unfinished basements, then the basement becomes a warehouse for all the stuff that you're going to want to use someday, but you're not using it today. And so you've got it stacked floor to ceiling against the walls usually. And obviously the inspector can't see through those boxes any better than the inspector could see through it if it had 2x4s against the wall and some sheetrock.
Yeah. And, sellers, it's not uncommon either for, there to be issues in a house if there's like a torrential rain. They say, well, my basement's never been wet. Well, you know what? That's possibly true. You can't, if you have got a funnel cloud over your house and they never did, chances are you're going to get water, and they never did. What's to say they were lying? Unless there's physical proof of that. So there's a lot of that, I understand the passion in it. I understand the feeling betrayed. Like, okay, well, why do I have to deal with this? I get that. But some of it's common sense. If you know that closet was full and you find something after it's not full anymore, there's just no way that inspector could have found it. Your realtor wasn't hiding it. It's just the nature of how it went down. So not making any excuses by any means, just saying that, there is that human factor. If everybody was perfect, we wouldn't have unperfect houses.
Well, that's true, and the it really is about having reasonable expectations is really what it boils down to.
Exactly.
And your example of the full closet, having a reasonable expectation of what the inspector can and can't do. No buyer would want to pay an inspector enough money to go through and move all the boxes and, as you said, unpack the closet for every room that ought to be inspected. That would cost so much that it would be prohibitive. And the end result is the buyer wouldn't hire the inspection done at all, which would be even worse.
Right, because they couldn't afford it.
Exactly.
Absolutely. So let's talk about appraisals, because there's a lot of misconception about what realtors can do with appraisals. Will you explain who the actual client for the appraiser is?
Well, that could vary, but typically, in most transactions, the client is actually the bank. And a lot of times, the buyer of the home doesn't get a copy of the inspection, or the appraisal, I'm sorry. And certainly, the realtor rarely gets a copy. Frankly, the realtor gets a copy of the appraisal generally only when there's some kind of a problem, or they get it after the fact. But rarely does the realtor see the appraisal kind of while the transaction is in process, shall we say. So it's pretty hard for a realtor, even though realtors do certainly have training, experience, et cetera, in thinking about the value of a home, the appraiser is not giving that opinion to the realtor. They may not even be giving it to the buyer. Now, obviously, it depends on who's hired the appraisal. If you've got a cash transaction, the buyer should hire their own appraiser, and that should be one of the inspections that they ask for, just like they ask for a roof inspection. Because sometimes we forget in those cash transactions there is no lender sitting out there who's going to require an appraisal. So that's a time when the buyer needs to say, well, I want an appraisal, just to make sure that whatever I'm paying is within the realm of reason. Now, I think another important thing about appraisers is to remember that, just like the other people in the transaction we talked about, appraisers aren't going to be perfect either, and you can get two appraisers that come up with different answers. If you're talking about a property in, shall we say, a typical price range of $90,000 to $220,000, where there's a lot of activity in the marketplace, then two appraisers ought to be reasonably close in their answer. But if you get at the extreme, so you're talking about selling that house that's worth, the buyer and seller have agreed it's worth $20, or they've agreed it's worth $2 million. In those cases, there is not that much market activity at either extreme, And so you could get appraisers who differ widely because there's no market data or not enough market data at the extremes for them to come up with different, that they could easily come up with vastly different answers. So once again, where we think about all this as kind of a science, we think home inspection is a science and we think appraisal is a science. And both of them have a lot of art. It's not as precise as people would like to think.
It's really not. I had a really good appraiser here in town that taught me how to do market analysis. And so anytime that we were both on the same file, he would say, okay, well, how far off were you? And whenever I got to where I was about 5,000 to 1,000, he was like, that's about how close we can get. So there you go. You've made it. It really, and it can be very skewed with what's actually on the market and have sold in the last year because that's what they've got to use. So, they have to explain why they use something outside of those parameters. So they have specific parameters that they have to stay in. So if it's in a subdivision, it has to stay in the subdivision. Supposed to be within 6 months, but sometimes they have to go out a year. So there's a lot of things that really mess with those numbers. And condition is also a big factor. They're not supposed to done it for condition, but we all know that houses the condition is what helps sell them. So, otherwise you're overpricing it. So that's a fun one. And just on the realtor aspect side of that, we typically don't see the full appraisal. They don't want us to know on the other side how much it was valued for. So say I was listing it, the buyer is the one that the appraisal is technically for, not the seller. And so whenever they send us the list of requirements to make it acceptable to the bank, we only see the bad sheet that says, okay, well, you got to fix all these things. We don't get to see the full appraisal. We don't get to see what the comps were or anything like that unless the buyer gives us permission. So just know that. And another thing that people should understand is that inspectors are there to inspect the whole house. Appraisers inspect, square footage, and oftentimes they don't even get on the roof anymore. So that's not a full-blown inspection, so don't count on that to be something that says, okay, well, this is wrong with it. They're looking at what the standard is that makes it loanable, not what makes it, the full function like a home inspection would. So I think there's a lot of confusion on whose role is what in that.
Yeah, I agree. I think a lot of times appraisers in their full report, they make note of some of the same things that a whole house inspector might make note of. So there's a tendency probably to think that, okay, well, I'm actually getting 2 inspections, but you're really not, because the appraisers, the rules that govern an appraiser and what the appraiser looks for are completely different than those that apply to a whole house inspection.
Yeah. So let's talk about registered offenders. I know you and I have talked about this on the show before, but I want to go back to that and just make sure that, because probably a lot of people didn't hear it the first time. What is the statutes for when they're supposed to disclose? Or I know there's an error of time that they're no longer required. Will you go through that?
Sure. One of the things that our current real estate contracts cover is right in the contract, there's a reference to the website so that any buyer who's interested can take that information and go to the internet and go to the website where registered sex offenders are required to be listed. But you have to keep in mind that information is only as good as the registered sex offender makes it. It's kind of the old story about garbage in, garbage out of a computer. Because in this instance, what we're expecting is someone who basically, by definition, is a criminal, and we're saying, okay, you criminal, now register or else. So, first of all, we have somewhat of an unreasonable expectation that all of these people who are, by definition, have criminal background are going to be honest all of a sudden. Now, many of them are because they fear retribution if they're not. So, most of the sex offenders that are required to register do a pretty good job of registering just because, out of fear that they'll find themselves back in the pokey for having failed to do so. So the first problem is whether or not the list is accurate, just based upon where the data came from. Then secondly, you have to be aware that you could look at the website today, poke in an address that you're thinking about buying, spend 2 weeks negotiating the deal, you get it under contract, you go back to the website, and the information has changed. Or, for that matter, you actually buy the property, you close, and you move in, and find out the day after you move in that someone on the list has moved in next door. So this is not going to be perfect, and as long as you go into it as a buyer with the understanding that it's not going to be perfect, you are given notice in the contract, it's required by state law, that this list is out there, gives you the website so that you can go look. But once again, we tend to think this is going to give us an absolute answer. And all it can do is tell us, here's the folks who have registered as of today, which obviously doesn't include people who haven't registered, and it can change. It's dynamic. It changes every day. And I have certainly seen transactions where a buyer actually did their own due diligence like they should. They read that information in the contract and realized they could check themselves. So they went to the internet and they checked and they, wiped the sweat off their brow and said, oh, good, I can buy this property. And then they get into contract and find out that the information changes someplace along the way. So it's just important that people realize that, once again, this isn't going to be a perfect answer. It's better than the days when we had no list. But just because it's on the internet doesn't make it right. And B, it certainly can change.
Yeah. I mean, you can't help if you live in an area where there are quite a few rentals, or for that matter, say, he moved back home with mom or she moved back home with mom and she was a registered offender. Things like that are just going to happen.
And in my experience, I could say that I've seen that. It's not like you said, it's not just rentals. I've seen that happen in very, very high-end neighborhoods. Someone's on the registry and buys $1 million house. That happens. Yeah. So it's not just a stigma on a particularly low-priced home. It's one that you can find in any neighborhood. And if you just go out to the website and look at it, you'll see it. Absolutely.
We had one that they bought the house. The neighbor came bebopping over and said, hey, by the way, I'm a registered offender. And just thought the whole neighborhood knew. Come to find out the whole neighborhood didn't know. The former owners didn't know. And he had committed his act prior to 1989, so he's no longer required to register. So what do you do then? I can tell you that my guy just said, listen, you ever step foot in my yard again, you're not going to be happy with the end result. But, you feel, as a real estate agent, you feel like, wow, what could we have done differently to make that outcome different? In that particular case, there just wasn't one. So fortunately, he's kind of an intimidating guy. I don't think he's going to have any problems.
Yeah.
We'll be right back after this commercial break.
Southwest Topeka has a good neighbor. State Farm agent Jim Garrison, now at 29th and Urish. If your current insurance situation has you going around in circles, get off the roundabout and stop in and meet Jim and his wonderfully efficient staff. Let Jim Garrison give you a quote and make the Garrison comparison. He's confident that with State Farm's competitive rates, the right coverage, and his unmatched service, you'll want to make him your new insurance agent. Like a good neighbor, State Farm is there, and Jim Garrison is there for you, northeast of the roundabout at 29th and Urish.
Thanks for joining us again. This is Karey Brown, broker, owner of Realty Executives Preferred Advisors, and you're listening to Real Estate 101. And I'm back here with Vern Jarboe with Sloan Law Firm. So let's talk about another big one is any kind of death or, tragedy that happens in a home. What is the requirements to disclose?
Well, that's a really interesting question, and whenever a lawyer uses the word interesting, that's kind of a red flag to anybody listening, because what it says is, I don't really know the answer. So, the questions I know the answers to are not interesting anymore. It's the ones where I don't know that are more interesting to think about. And unfortunately or fortunately, depending on your view of the world, in Kansas, we don't really have a rule that deals with what I'm going to call a category of properties that are stigmatized. Another phrase that you can find if you go out and Google this is the phrase is called psychologically impacted properties. And stigmatized and psychologically impacted are properties which are affected by something that's not physical. It's not related to the property per se, but it's maybe something off-site, or it may be something that offends some people intellectually but not others. So a death in the house is just one example of that. If you've had a death in a house, I think we could agree some people would care. We would also probably agree not everyone does.
Right.
Now, if we think about that from the perspective of some people are going to care, then the next question from a realtor's perspective is, well, are they going to find out about it? And, I think that the neighborhood network works pretty good. And usually if you buy a house where something like that has happened, then some neighbor is going to share that information with you. And so when we think about murders, suicides, hauntings, or just the everyday, they died of natural causes, but they died in the home, that's going to happen. And if you think about it in the old days, if you're buying a house that's 100 years old, there's some likelihood that someone died in that house. We went through a period where people didn't die in the home so much because, they would get sick and they would be taken to a hospital and they probably passed away in the hospital. And now it's almost like we're seeing it go the other direction because we have people who become incurably ill, but they want to die at home. They want to die among their family members. And if they're not on some kind of healthcare process that requires them to be in the hospital, then the doctor may say, well, that's fine. If the family can get you the right kind of bed and take care of your medication needs, then yes, you can go home. And so we're having, I think, almost more people dying at home now than we might have had 30 years ago due to those changes in kind of society's philosophy about such things. With the end result being we have, more homes that had a death in them. So I guess what all that boils down to is if you're the kind of person as a buyer who would care about such things, it's something to ask about. Most realtors take the position that if they're aware of it, because the seller says, by the way, my wife committed suicide in the garage, most realtors are going to take the position that they want to see that disclosed. From a realtor's perspective, there's just no percentage in not disclosing. First of all, the house will sell. There's somebody out there who's going to buy it that doesn't care. And that's the buyer we want when we have one of these stigmatizing effects on the properties. We want a buyer who doesn't care.
Absolutely.
There are buyers who don't care. I helped with a sale one time where there was either a murder-suicide or a double suicide, and we didn't really know which. It didn't matter, obviously. And we still found a buyer because there are buyers who don't care. And frankly, in that case, that property actually sold for more than we thought it would. More than it had appraised for, despite the fact that we were disclosing this condition, because there are buyers who don't care. Now, there are buyers who do care, and I think the worst scenario from a seller's perspective is to sell a house without disclosing it to a buyer who does care. Neighbor tells them, and then that buyer is mad, and they want to sue everybody that touched the deal. They want to sue the realtor. They want to sue. I know of one case where the buyer sued the realtors, the title company, the land surveyor, the home inspector, the seller. They sued everybody on the theory that everybody knew and nobody told the buyer. And so it's one of those things. I usually express it as life's too short. If you're a realtor, you're aware of one of these conditions, life's too short not to disclose it because the house will sell, but we want to sell somebody who doesn't care.
And I think the key thing is aware. We don't always meet the neighbors, so unless they come out, and it's not that we don't talk to them. If they come out and want to converse with us, it's not our parents' error where everybody knows everybody and everybody's fine with sharing. We kind of stay to ourselves more now. So unless the neighbor calls up and says, hey, by the way, we don't always know. And if a seller's not honest and doesn't tell us, then we're kind of in a predicament. So
I agree. And the other problem is, there's a lot of sellers. I was talking to a seller who, the husband had cancer and he had wanted to go home to pass away and came home for the last couple of weeks of his life, died there in the home, family all around. Everybody was real pleased. Not pleased that he died, but that was going to happen. So it was just a matter of where. But they were pleased with the opportunity to really spend quality time with him in his last days. And that seller just didn't even think that they needed to tell anybody that, because it was just, oh yeah, that happened, but so what? And so, yeah, you're absolutely right. The realtor often is the last person to know. You would have to be either a seller who is thoughtful enough to say, gee, I wonder if that matters, I should talk to my realtor, or a neighbor who you might say is nosy enough or forward enough to come over and tell you. And that you can't assume that either one of those things is going to happen. Usually, I'd say most often, the realtor doesn't know.
So let's go into what a realtor should do. Is it our job to go out and find this information?
Actually, no. The law in some states actually imposes a burden upon the realtor to, I always call it go on the Easter egg hunt, but not in Kansas. In Kansas, 20 years ago, the law was modified to say that a realtor has an absolute duty to recommend to buyers that they get property inspected. Now, back at that time, 20 years ago, most realtors believed it was a good idea to tell buyers to get properties inspected, but it wasn't actually a duty to do that. And on the other hand, at that time, what the law said was a realtor should disclose everything they knew or should have known. So when we imposed upon realtors the duty to recommend inspections, we took away the duty to disclose what they should have known. And basically because that's an impossible task. That's kind of like knowing whether or not the Chiefs won last weekend. Today we know the answer to that question. Before the game was played, we might have sat around having coffee talking about who we thought, whether or not we thought they would win a particular game, but we didn't know. And afterwards, you say, oh, well, I should have known they were going to lose because their star quarterback was out of the game. Well, as it turned out, the star quarterback was out, and they won anyway. But, there's always that belief, well, I could have known, I should have known, I might have thought about it, which is really just an impossible burden from a realtor's perspective. So the law now requires a realtor to urge buyers to get inspections, and rather than going on the Easter egg hunt, so to speak, themselves. It's kind of foolish to think that you could take a real estate licensee, and not only would they know everything in the world about helping a buyer and seller write a contract and close a deal, but they would also know about plumbing. That's just not going to happen. So now we've got, hopefully, the burden properly placed so that we suggest to the buyer they get a plumbing inspection, we hire a plumber, we hope the plumber does a good job, and finds what a plumber should find in doing such an inspection.
Right. I just wanted to thank you for being on the show. And again, Vern Jarboe, he is my favorite real estate attorney, and he is with Sloan Jarboe Law Firm. And Vern, do you want to tell them how to get a hold of you in case they need a real estate attorney?
Sure. We help people all the time. If they want to call the phone number in Topeka at 785-357-6311. We're also out on the internet at sloanlawfirm.com, or they can drop me an email at bjarboe, B as in Victory Jarboe, Jarboe, at sloanlawfirm.com. Thank you for the opportunity.
And thank you. You've been listening to Real Estate 101, and join us next week for another show.
Thank you for listening to Real Estate 101 with the Karey Brown team from Realty Executives Preferred Advisors. Tune in again next Sunday at 11 o'clock for Real Estate 101.